Part 2, in which we meet Fat Maggie's father and mother and come to understand the strange circumstances of her birth. What shall follow, then, is the tale of Captain Delight, hardly a name to inspire even a tingle of fright in a small child, let alone excite the fears of a brave buccaneer. And while the sight of this lady could still the blood in your veins, 'twould not be from fear, 'twas from her near profane beauty that made it hard to maintain a heartbeat when she was nearby. But despite her most disarming features, Captain Delight is a vastly dangerous, powerful creature, a pirate queen. You'd know it not to meet her, so elegant and refined this fine wench was. Perhaps, then, you've heard the more ominous name by which she is known, infamous, acclaimed. Does Fat Maggie ring any bells? For 'tis the very same woman of which I speak. Fat Maggie Delight, this is her story. It began long ago aboard the dark ship Foul Glory. There was a man gifted with fine arts of a gustatory nature. The man was called Arthur, and he was ship's cook, hired by the fearsome Captain Chinook, the mere mention of whom invariably shook many seasoned knaves to the very core. Captain Chinook had many a vice, fine jewels, cigars, martinis on ice, but these he would ignore in a heartbeat, a trice, were he to be presented with an elegant meal. And because of his obsession with the finest of edibles, he found Arthur, a man of quite incredible skill in the galley to create for him nibbles of the most spectacular sort. Found, though, is perhaps not the right word. Captain Chinook had been on the hunt for someone to stir his pots and his senses, and he eventually heard of this most wondrous chef named Arthur. Arthur cooked for queens and kings the world around and had finally chosen to settle down with his young family in a tiny seaside town and open a tavern. Upon a midnight raid, Captain Chinook did descend upon Arthur and cruelly brought to an end all the man held dear his family Chinook did send to Davy Jones's locker, and whisked Arthur away aboard his bleak ship, commanded him cook, and did cruelly whip the man were he to show even the smallest slip of sadness for his lost life. And so cook Arthur did, and though he had naught but hate for the cold-hearted captain, he did still create for Chinook the most marvelous foods to satiate art's own need for some comfort and joy. Ebony crab roast with sea garlic and pear, Azorian doves stuffed with emerald marbled Gruyere, crimson shark steak grilled with whale milk camembert. There was no end to what this man could concoct. And life might have carried on this way indefinitely, with Arthur cooking to assuage his misery over lost love and life and family, and Captain Chinook eating up every minute. But a strange event did again change the course of Arthur's life, replacing his remorse with joy. 'Twas a tiny seahorse he did happen to catch one early misty morn. Captain Chinook would often demand that Arthur create strangely wondrous grand dishes to fill his ever-expanding belly. His new idea was for a seahorse stew, a heretofore untested and untried brew, which, the ship's cook Arthur knew, should remain so for a very good reason. Seahorses were the treasured friends of merfolk. Their deaths by human hand would surely provoke a most swift and furious response, would evoke their cold desire for vengeance. But what Chinook wanted, Chinook always got, and so that was a herd of seahorses filling his pot. And so one morn, praying he'd not be caught, Arthur cast his nets. After an hour or so, he'd had enough success to cook up a great and accursed mess of a stew for his high and mighty madness, the gluttonous Captain Chinook. Shaking, Art brought his catch down to the galley and placed them gently in a watery corral. He collapsed into a chair and tried to regain the morale he needed to complete this terrible task. And as he sat and his shaking was slowly stilled, he watched his tiny prisoners and was suddenly filled with wonder at these forbidden creatures, utterly thrilled by their tiny, elegant selves. One in particular caught his attention, a crimson horse whose every wee dimension glittered with reflected light as she sat in calm suspension, regarding her captor with grave eyes. As Arthur stared at the tiny horse, he knew there was nary a single force on the briny sea great enough to make him divorce himself from his better sense and murder this wondrous animal. He vowed then and there to use his wile and wit to fool Captain Chinook, that voracious twit, into thinking the most exquisite stew he would dine upon this eve was full of seahorse tails. Without further ado, he crept back on deck to release his catch and hopefully correct the wrong he so very near had subjected the wee horses to. The herd did disperse right away, back to the depths to roam and play, all but one, the red horse, did for a moment stay to gaze once more upon Arthur. To Arthur it appeared that she gave her thanks, before, with flick of tail, she turned and sank into the depths, and he turned too, and went back to the dank galley once more. That night, Captain Chinook did indeed dine on seahorse stew, which he pronounced divine, not knowing that he in fact chewed on stewed sea grapevines, most cleverly disguised. And that night, Arthur had a most marvelous dream. He was visited by a woman who he did deem to be the loveliest he had ever seen. Long glittering red hair, sea-green eyes, she slid into his bunk, and parting marble thighs, she made love to him as though he were a fine prize, and not the lowly cook he had become. And when he woke the next morn, he felt as though he'd been reborn, and for the first time he did cease to mourn his lost wife and family. In bemused days he went about his day, as he always did, but found his heart got in the way when he prepared to slay a frigate bird for his captain's dinner. So, once again, the captain did feast on vegetable disguised as beast. But, once again, he did not take the least bit of notice, so clever was Arthur's ruse. And for a second night, Arthur dreamed of the lass, of ruby hair, and eyes green like glass, and once again their love-making did surpass any dull care he had heretofore experienced. For 9 wondrous nights Arthur dreamed this maid, and for 9 wondrous days the pain did fade from his heart while he carried on his charade of serving Captain Chinook the creatures he did desire. But then, on the 10th night, as Arthur fell eager to bed, when the lass appeared, he was surprised, for instead of laying next to him, she placed a babe beside his head on the pillows, and said, "This, my dear Arthur, is our daughter, born of man and Aphrodite, spared from slaughter. She is my thanks to you for returning me to water, while I played in seahorse form. She'll be all the love you need. She'll nourish your heart and soul. She'll feed you as you feed others, free you as you freed me. She'll be your everyday delight, but don't underestimate this lovely sprite, for as daughter of an amorous goddess she might prove to be a handful. And now, my dear, I must away. Perhaps we'll meet again one day." And those were the last words that she did say before the lovely goddess went on her way. So when Arthur awoke early next morn, he was not surprised to find a newborn, wrapped in leaves of sea buckthorn, asleep beside him.